So once again, welcome to May's Touch event, a series, one of this month's installment of the series of conversations in which the State Bar of Georgia invites all members of the bar to participate in connecting with each other, especially in these times of isolation, which are beginning to change, thankfully, but still, as we find our ways through the new parameters of our lives, we have started these monthly meetings exploring various aspects of well-being and health in our profession, especially as we know that there's a lot of evidence and a lot of research now that we are in need of care and attention for our own well-being, for our own benefit as humans, professionals, and for the benefit of our clients. So in one way or the other, this is what these conversations explore in different ways. Today, we go to the roots of the well-being habits that we have as lawyers, and we will talk about planting the seeds of well-being and how it all starts in law school. And we will focus on the importance of what we see, experience, and observe in addition to learning in law school, and how that really shapes the ideas that we have and the habits that we developed about taking care of our mental, emotional, and physical health, or not doing that, and how we take these habits into our practice. What are the lessons that help us or that get in the way? And what can we begin to do differently? And very importantly, how can we begin to create a cohesive philosophy and practice of health and well-being, starting in law school and lasting throughout our professional lives as practicing lawyers? We have an outstanding panel of speakers that I can't wait to introduce in a moment. But before I do that, let me take care of a couple of logistics about our shared time on Zoom together. Oh, and my name is Floyd, and I am co-chair of the Mental Wellbeing Subcommittee, member of the Wellness Committee of the State Bar of Georgia, as well as a member of the Lawyer Assistance Program of the State Bar of Georgia, a practicing attorney of a number of years. And I am focusing my practice on technology, transactions. My experience is primarily in big law, but in addition, I have expanded my skills by being a certified integral coach and a breathwork practitioner. Additional practices that I bring both into my personal practice, but I share with colleagues and with others anytime I can. So with that, a couple of reminders about Zoom and how it works. I suggest that you select the speaker view option in Zoom so that you are able to see the speakers when they are talking. You can do that by going to the view icon in the top right corner and selecting speaker view from there. The host will keep everyone muted except for the speakers, so we ask you to stay on mute until the host unmutes you or we get to the questions part and you wish to ask a question. During the Q&A time, please use the raise the hand feature, which is at the bottom of the screen where there's a button that says reactions. If you click on that, you will see raise a hand. It looks like this, and then you can lower your hand and we'll call on you. You can also, if you wish to ask a question without speaking up or being identified, you can send me a private message, Plum and Rusev, and I will ask your question to our participants. Please remember that this session is recorded, so those colleagues of ours who are not able to join us today can watch it. It will become available on the media page on the Lawyers Leaving Well website, as well as the YouTube channel of the State Bar of Georgia. Another important point about the recording, if you send any private messages to me, they're not recorded anywhere. So feel free to ask any question that is important for you to ask. because that is what we really invite, and is very powerful when we can engage in these questions, including the uncomfortable ones. That's the ones we need to explore the most. And so with that, I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers. And I will start by mentioning that our very own president of the State Bar of Georgia, Dawn Jones, is joining us, and she will be providing also her perspective on the question that we're engaging today. There's no need to tell you much about Dawn. What I do like to stress, though, about what she has brought to this presidency is a very holistic and integrated approach in her work as a bar president, which inevitably draws both on being in the healthcare field and continuing that in mad malpractice as a lawyer. So I have not seen a more multidimensional and multifaceted approach to well-being so far at the bar, for which I'm very grateful and on which we will continue to draw as we go forward. So my personal thanks for that to President Jones. We also have Professor Charity Scott. Many of us know her from a number of presentations that she has already done for the bar, including most recently in the Living Well to Practice Well CAV of the State Bar. She's a professor of law emerita at Georgia State University College of Law, and was the founding director of the Center for Law, Health, and Society, and its associated legal clinic with the Health Law Partnership. Again, she also brings a very interdisciplinary perspective, because the HELP clinic was focused on interdisciplinary community collaboration to advance the health and well-being of low-income children and their families. And Professor Scott has taught, published, and presented on health law and policy, bioethics, torts, negotiation, mediation, and mindfulness. She has truly been instrumental in developing mindfulness and wellness programs at Georgia State Law. And I personally do not know anyone else who has done more than she has done about integrating mindfulness and wellness awareness and well-being practices into law school, but also inviting us as lawyers to find ways to do that in our practice. So many thanks for that, and many thanks for your participation today, Professor Scott. Professor Daisy Floyd is our next guest, and she is University Professor of Law and Ethical Formation at Mercer University School of Law, where she also served as Dean from 2004 to 2010, and again from 2014 to 17. She has taught civil procedure, advanced legal ethics, evidence, remedies, and the legal profession. Professor Floyd's teaching and research interests include the ways in which higher education shapes students' ethical development and the possibilities for cross-disciplinary collaboration within education. Professor Floyd's interest in the well-being of law students and lawyers and her work on professional identity formation led her to being one of the several legal educators nationwide to teach a Carnegie seminar on legal education as part of the research for what ultimately became the Carnegie Foundation's widely acclaimed report on legal education, Educating Lawyers, in 2007. She has written and spoken frequently on the ways in which legal education shapes the well-being and identity of American lawyers, and is currently writing a book entitled The Lawyers We Need, The Professional Identity of the American Lawyer, expected to be published by Carolina Academic Press in the fall of 2022. And Professor Timothy Floyd, who is Tommy Malone Distinguished Chair in Trial Advocacy and Director of Experiential Education at Mercer University School of Law. In addition to supervising clinical and externship programs, he teaches a variety of courses in criminal law and in legal ethics. Professor Floyd has published 2 books and is the author of numerous articles in the area of legal ethics, law and religion, and criminal law and the death penalty. He is the co-editor of the book, Can a Good Christian Be a Good Lawyer? Homilies, Witnesses, and Reflections, and he is currently working on a book entitled Near the Cross, Reflections on Justice, Mercy, and the Death Penalty. He has represented several defendants in death penalty cases, including Louis Jones Jr., the first person convicted under the Federal Death Penalty Act of 1994. You can hear just from these bios what an incredible breadth and depth of perspective we have, and I cannot wait to get into our conversation. So without much more, Professor Scott.
Thank you, Plum. And I'd like to briefly set the stage before we begin our conversation by saying that what we're doing is connecting the overall theme of these touch events that Plum and Don have been promoting throughout the year, which is connecting what's the relationship between lawyer health and well-being to lawyering competency. That is a professionalism and actually the competent practice of law. So the first thing that I wanted to mention was the current state of law students' health and well-being. It's not what we might like it to be, but this is what the ABA's Path to Lawyer Well-being report said about the state of student health and well-being, law student health. Law students start, and I quote, law school with high life satisfaction and strong mental health measures. That's when they arrive at law school. But within the first year of law school, they experience a significant increase in anxiety and depression. Research suggests that law students are among the most dissatisfied, demoralized, and depressed of any graduate student population. What's important about that is that as the Path to Wellbeing, Lawyer Wellbeing report from the ABA illustrates, to be a good lawyer, you have to be a healthy lawyer. That is, that lack of well-being can seriously, adversely affect competence as a lawyer. And there have been a couple of recent reports on legal education that put certain skills and traits high on the list of what lawyers are needed as soon as they graduated from law school, needed immediately for practice. And these they don't tend to be the things we spend a lot of time teaching or talking about in law school. It's not about statutory interpretation or, even drafting. Top 10 skills, traits, and qualities of competent lawyers were said to be things like diligence, honoring commitments, integrity and trustworthiness, having a strong work ethic, courtesy and respect for others. Those are the top 10 skills, traits, and qualities that are needed for competent lawyering, says the Institute for Advancement of American Legal Education. Among the 12 building blocks for competency that this organization has recently come up in 2020, 3 of those 12 building blocks for competency are the ability to manage a law-related workload responsibly, ability to cope with the stresses of legal practice, and the ability to pursue self-directed learning. What the overall message, linking the stress levels, anxiety levels, and other challenges to the health and well-being of law students to their competencies, the message is burnout, being stressed out, being overwhelmed, being on a hair trigger to the stresses that are inevitable, whether they're in law practice or in other work life. You're simply not going to be as competent a lawyer if you can't get control of emotions, mental health, and bring stability to your life as a professional. True also for law students. So today's program, we're going to do 3 things. We're going to talk about how law schools have contributed to law students' current lack of health, a lack of well-being. Second, we're going to talk about the changes that are currently being implemented in law schools and that will be needed in the future to foster students' well-being simultaneously with their professional competence. And finally, we want to talk about how lawyers, those in the practicing bar, can join with law schools to support law students' preparation for practice and how to do this more holistically in the future. So that I'd like to ask Tim, if I could. Let's be lawyer-like and define our terms. How should we define well-being for law students and the role of law schools in supporting it?
Well, thanks, Charity. Thanks also to Plum and Dawn and really to everybody on this call, because this is such an important topic. But you're right, Charity, we ought to start at the beginning and just what is it we're talking about here today? Charity's already made reference to some statistics that we're going to talk about in more detail about the degree of real acute distress among law students and new lawyers. And that's often where our discussion begins and ends when we talk about well-being in lawyers. And there's a good reason for that, that the kind of acute distress, substance abuse, clinical depression, other serious mental illnesses, those are real problems for the persons experiencing that. And unfortunately, they also have tremendous ramifications for future clients of those law students who are experiencing that. We'll be talking a lot about those problems today. But I think it's important for our conversations about well-being and really for our work about well-being to recognize that well-being needs to be a topic on the agenda for everyone involved in legal education and in the bar. It's true that most law students and most lawyers don't suffer from clinical depression or substance abuse, although the incidence is way too high. But it is an unfortunate fact that for most law students and lawyers, the process of becoming a lawyer is associated with declines in overall well-being. That's true for a sizable majority of law students and new lawyers. Our goal as legal educators, and here I'm speaking personally, but I'm pretty confident the other legal educators on this call, and also know that a good many others around the country share this goal. It's not just to keep students from experiencing the kind of acute distress we're talking about. Our goal is for our students overall to thrive. And what I mean by that is for each of them to become a competent, effective practitioner, to represent their clients well, to serve society well, to practice with ethics and integrity, and finally, to experience fulfillment and satisfaction in doing those things. That's really how I would define well-being. It incorporates all of that. Now, over the last decade or so, there are many of us who have turned to the concept that's called professional identity, and that's another concept we'll talk about more over the next hour or so. It reflects the idea that preparing to become a lawyer is about more than learning certain law or learning how to read cases. It's even about more than learning certain lawyering skills like counseling, negotiation, cross-examination. Becoming a lawyer is really about becoming a certain type of person who is a lawyer. The focus of professional identity is on who is becoming a lawyer, what kind of person are we becoming as we take on this identity of a lawyer, and how well can we integrate the core values of who we already are with the core professional values that we all want to aspire to. And again, we're going to talk about that in more detail today too. For now, let me just stop and say, for my many decades now in legal education, the most promising thing I've seen is the relatively recent focus on well-being, led first and foremost by Charity Scott and many others, and this new focus on professional identity. I think that holds more promise for the well-being and the thriving of lawyers than anything I've seen in a long time.
Thanks, Tim. And I have to say that, doing some research on the state of well-being or lack thereof for law students in legal education and thinking, gosh, legal education is part of the problem. I'm hoping we can make it part of the solution, but it's part of the problem. And I've been in legal education for over 3 decades. I guess that means I have been part of the problem for a long period of time as well. So this has been a complete educational experience and experimental procedure as I try things out with the students to see how I can support their health and well-being. So I'd like to turn it over to you, Daisy, and ask you, how does legal education impact students and their well-being, for better or for worse?
Well, thank you, Charity, Plum, and everyone who's on the call. I'm delighted to be here. So I do want to give you a brief overview of some things that those of us who've been researching this have found through the years. And I want to start with the positive, because I think while there is lots of room for improvement, and certainly I do believe that legal education has been a contributor to a lack of well-being, but I do want to recognize that there are a lot of good things that happen in legal education too. And when we talk particularly with students and lawyers about their experience of legal education, they report some really positive things that can show us where we're doing things well. And then they also cite some things that I think really tell us that we've got room and a need for improvement. So let's start with the positive. The first one, those of you on the call who are all lawyers won't be surprised, is that we do a very good job in legal education of teaching students analytical and reasoning skills. That long traditional purpose of law school as teaching students to think like a lawyer is being done, and being done quite well. And in fact, the fact that those of you on the call, so many lawyers do have successful lives, make a positive difference in the lives of their clients, as an indication that there's a lot of good that goes on in legal education. Associated with that, students will self-report that the process of legal education has given them a greater understanding of the world, of others, and their role in the world. They also will tell you that they've gained a lot of confidence and independence, a real sense of accomplishment. I think particularly for students who've come right out of their undergraduate experience, that process of legal education has been really important to their maturation and learning about the world in positive ways. They report an ability to depersonalize agreement, which is a really good thing in a lawyer. Now, you all have probably experienced, and I always warn my first year students about this, it can be irritating to those closest to you who are not lawyers that you're so good at depersonalizing disagreement, but it's an important thing for the world and for lawyers, and they do that. They develop that through law school, and with a related ability to articulate arguments from multiple perspectives and to see an issue from multiple perspectives. So a lot of what we want to have happen in law school is happening in law school. Now, the other side of this is that education, which is good at these things, is leading to some consequences that are not so good. Law students self-report that law school has a negative effect on their relationships with their peers in law school and relationships that they had coming into law school. And sometimes students report that as a loss of existing relationships or as a diminution of their ability to form new relationships. They do report a real focus on the external, that is the real prizes of law school. And if you ask a group of law students 3 weeks into law school, what are the prizes of law school? They will tell you what they are. They are being in the top 25 or 10% of the class. They're making law review. They're making maybe making moot court, getting a particular kind of job, getting certain grades. So very early on, law students are told that there are certain prizes of law school, and they become focused on that. Now, the real problem with that is that we tend to define those prizes narrowly. And the way in which we define those prizes means that not everyone can achieve those prizes. After all, if we define success institutionally as being in the top 10% or the top quarter of your class, we have just created failure for 75 to 90% of our students. And so this emphasis on those prizes ends up for many students, they self-report this, that they have feelings of inadequacy and failure because they don't compete successfully for those top prizes. They will report that there is an emphasis on the cognitive in law school, that learning to think like a lawyer, which then de-emphasizes or devalues a lot of other matters, including emotional reactions and, again, relationships. And Tim's going to talk a little more about that, but this first year experience where we're so much in people's heads, that can send an institutional message that other things don't matter. So that results, they tell us, in a loss of purpose for many students and a loss of sense of self for many students. And so taking on this identity as a lawyer can, for many of them, come at the expense of their own personal values and emotions. And that can, of course, get in the way of well-being and satisfaction. And then what we see, and I think Charity's already alluded to this, is we see that there is a quick shift when they shift to those prizes of law school from intrinsic motivation to extrinsic motivation. Just briefly to define intrinsic motivation, that's when you choose to do something because you genuinely enjoy it or it furthers a fundamental purpose in your life. Going to the movies, going for a walk with your dog, exercising, reading a book. Those things we tend to be intrinsically motivated for because we enjoy them. There might be things we don't enjoy doing, like studying for a torts exam, but we know that we need to learn torts to be a good lawyer. And so that might be an intrinsic motivation to do it because it fulfills a fundamental purpose. Extrinsic motivations, on the other hand, are those things that we do because we want to achieve extrinsic prizes or we want to avoid guilt or fear. And as Tim will develop further, one thing to remember about this distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivations is that there's nothing wrong with extrinsic motivations. I tell my students every year, I love what I do for a living. I would not be doing it if I didn't get paid for it. And that's a combination of intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. We're all motivated by both. The problem is that if extrinsic motivations begin to take dominance over your intrinsic motivations, that's when we see anxiety, depression, those sorts of things that get in the way of well-being. So we do see a lot happening in law students that they self-report as getting in the way of well-being and satisfaction.
Thank you, Daisy. And I know, Tim, that there's been a lot of research on what happens to law students while they're in law school in terms of their well-being and their attitudes and their psychological well-being and social well-being. You'll need to, if you'd like to talk about that, could you unmute? Thanks.
That's better. Yeah, just briefly, I want everybody to understand this isn't just somebody's opinion or their anecdotes based on their own experience of law school. There have been numerous studies over the last several decades and all reach pretty similar conclusions to the data, the results that Daisy has been referring to. One of the principal researchers and writers in this area happens to be on this call today. Larry Krieger, professor of law at Florida State University, is joining us today. And much of what I'm going to talk about here briefly comes from studies that Larry has been involved in with his colleague, Ken Sheldon, several extensive studies. But the most important thing I think we ought to recognize is a quick follow-up on what Daisy was just saying. Studies of law students show that when they enter law school, before they ever start, they tend to be higher than the general population in terms of their overall well-being. And yet, uniformly, the studies show that at the end, during the first year, certainly by the end of the first year, that has decreased to well below the levels of self-reported well-being by people generally. And that doesn't recover over the second and third years of law school. One of the most important findings, particularly from Larry Krieger, is that this decline in well-being is very closely associated with the shift from intrinsic motivation to extrinsic motivation. And again, as Daisy said, it's not that extrinsic is terrible and intrinsic is the only thing that's valuable, but it's remarkable the degree of the shift. And what psychological research, self-determination theory has shown us repeatedly now for decades is that too much reliance on extrinsic motivation, either positive, seeking external rewards, or the negative kind, fear of what people will say about you, or fear of disappointing other people, or anxiety. Those kinds of extrinsic motivations are generally overwhelmingly associated with negative well-being. And without going into detail right now, the studies have been pretty much uniform across the board, including the studies cited in the most recent Path to Wellbeing from the ABA just in the last few years. Krieger and Sheldon did another study that was a follow-up that I think is particularly intriguing, where they focused on two particular law schools. They called them Law School 1 and Law School 2, and I still don't know which law schools they were, and I don't think Larry's going to tell us. There were two law schools that had a lot in common. They had a lot in common in the sense that every law school in America has a lot in common. Daisy's going to talk in a few minutes about why law school is the way it is, but there's a lot of uniformity in legal education. But of these two law schools, Law School 1 was higher ranked in US News. It had better credentials in the objective sense of their entering students, LSAT, entering GPA. Their faculty was more highly respected within the legal profession, legal professoriate. The faculty at Law School 1 was more focused on academic scholarship and less focused on connection to real world practice of law. Law School 2 was a good law school. Their students were good students, but they didn't have quite the objective measures coming in. But one difference in the two law schools is that Law School 2 was much more focused in its curriculum and extracurricular activities on actual practice of law and a closer connection to the bench and bar. A couple of significant findings came from detailed studies, of longitudinal studies of these two law schools and their students. The students at Law School 2, the lower ranked law school, had higher levels of well-being. They also had higher performance, in particular, their performance on the multi-state bar exam. The most significant finding of that study is they hypothesized, and they found it to be borne out, that the support for autonomy at Law School 2, that students were given more agency, they were given more choices, they were given more support in terms of the array of options they might have in terms of jobs during and after law school, was a good deal higher. And the students expressed that they had more, they felt more autonomy at that law school. That, again, from self-determination theory, was no surprise, although the finding was pretty resounding, that autonomy and autonomy support led to much higher well-being and performance among those students. Finally, I wanted to very briefly mention, you could think of this as a follow-up study, but it's a study that Krieger and Sheldon did of a very large number of practicing lawyers in 4 different states. About 7,800 lawyers responded. What they found in that was really just finding out what factors lead to well-being among lawyers. Here are the factors that led to the most well-being among lawyers. Autonomy, people that felt like they had control over their own lives and work, and when they worked in institutions that provided support for autonomy. Second, relationships, connectedness. Lawyers who felt connected, who had good, strong relationships with other people within the profession and outside, had much higher levels of well-being. A feeling of competence, knowing what you're doing, a feeling of a job well done, was highly associated with well-being. Finally, intrinsic motivations, doing things for intrinsic reasons rather than extrinsic, leaded to more satisfaction and well-being. Finally, here's what I think is particularly interesting. Of the lawyers that had, well, let me put it this way. The factors that showed the least correlation with well-being are class rank in law school, whether you participated on a law journal, levels of income. Above certain amounts, at least, the more income was not associated much at all with a sense of well-being. Even the amount of law school debt, higher debts by and large were not associated with lower well-being, and lower debt with higher well-being. It's those other factors that I talked about first. So all of that research I think is fascinating, and it really helps inform a lot of what we've been doing in law school.
Thanks, Tim. And just to let Larry know, I've translated his research studies into the following principles. What makes lawyers happy? Three things, predominantly. Challenging work, meaningful work with people that they like. That's the relationship aspect. Challenging usually isn't a problem. It's, pretty much whatever you're doing, it's going to be challenging. So it's going to be interesting, challenging work, but meaningful. Does it relate to that intrinsic motivation about what's important to you? Are you fulfilling your purpose as a lawyer? And with people you like, it's all about the relationship. And in law school, I've also read, I think, surveys of law students that the most important factor in students feeling, a positive reaction to their law school was a close personal relationship with faculty. Not just the faculty, as teacher, not just as the coursework, but a close personal relationship with the faculty really mattered in terms of their attitudes towards law school. So what I'm interested in now, Daisy, if you could talk a little bit about it, so we do have all these unhappy law students. I mean, they're not all unhappy, but they're definitely, the research shows some challenges to their well-being. How did legal education get there? What does it do? Is it inevitable that we're just going to make unhappy law students? I mean, is there something about it? How does law school so uniformly do that? And maybe some of the folks on this call can reflect on their own law school experience and sort of wonder why that is.
It's a great question, Charity. It's one that I and others have spent a lot of time talking about. So I'm going to very briefly tell you a little bit about why modern legal education is the way it is today and what some pressures are, because as we think, and I think we want to, as a follow-up to this program, think about how we might implement some changes, it's important to understand who we are and why we are the way we are. I do want to say, Charity, I love that focus on purpose. I talk with a lot of law students and gathering research about why they came to law school. And I will tell you, the one common thread is they're attracted to law school because they know that they want their professional lives to have meaning. They want the work that they do to matter. They may not know exactly what that means in terms of how they're going to practice or what it's going to look like or even what the possibilities are. But I'm convinced that law students have that in common. They really want their work to be meaningful and to make a difference. And that's partly why when they get into that first year of law school and there is such a dominant reliance on the cognitive and learning law, that purpose kind of gets shoved aside. And I think that's why a lot of students report this loss of purpose or loss of self. So how did we come to be the way we are? Well, let's blame Harvard Law School. That's always a good place to start, but it's true in this case. You may have heard of Christopher Columbus Langdell. Christopher Columbus Langdell served as dean of Harvard Law School early on in the development of professional education in this country. And he made a number of changes to education while he was there that tended to be copied in law schools really all across the country and in other kinds of professional education. When he attended Harvard Law School was not required to sit for the bar. Undergraduate education was not required to go to law school or to sit for the bar. If you did choose to go to law school, the curriculum was not sequenced. It was not graded. You sort of started when you wanted, you stopped when you wanted, when you thought you were ready to pass the then oral exam to become a lawyer. The form of teaching was mainly through lecture and recitation. Students memorized lots of black letter law and would spit that back out for their teachers. Well, based on his own experiences, when he became dean, and he was dean for some 25 years, he made three big changes that ended up being copied by all other law schools, and to this day still mark modern legal education. The first is he brought the education of lawyers into the university and out of law offices, because up until that time, the primary method that most lawyers obtained their legal education was through apprenticeships in law firms. He wanted it to come into the university. He was at Harvard, it already had come in, but really come in a big way. And what that means is that it took on university values. That had lots of consequences for legal education. Maybe one of the most important was who law schools are hiring as faculty and what kinds of rewards and incentives are created for faculty. And basically that meant that you, instead of having practicing lawyers now teaching law students, you had people who were good law students who became law professors. They knew how to learn the law. They knew how to write and talk about the law. They didn't necessarily know how to practice law. Those were the people who became faculty. And for the most part, that model continues today. They get rewarded in large part for the research they produce. That continues to be the case. So his first big idea, really making legal education have that university model. Secondly, he believed that legal education ought to be a meritocracy. He did that for good reasons. He wanted to open it up, not just available for gentlemen or people from the right families, but he thought it ought to be a meritocracy. And that meant grades and competitive grades. He introduced and really emphasized making scholarships available to students because he himself had had a hard time paying for education, but that increased some of that pressure on grades. And so that competitive environment that we have in law schools today started with Harvard. And then the third big innovation was adopting the case method and Socratic pedagogy as the primary way of learning about the law. So instead of learning general rules of law, you read about cases and you learned to reason from the specific facts of a case to the general rules of law. So following Langdale's innovations, case books became the primary text for law schools. And instead of recitation and lecture, the interactive Socratic method became the dominant way of teaching. Those things were all good innovations, but they all three contribute, I think, to some of what we're seeing. And so in addition to law schools wanting to model themselves after Harvard, we've got a few other modern pressures I just want to briefly mention. One is ABA accreditation. You all know that in almost every state, in order to take the bar, you have to graduate from an ABA accredited law school. So most law schools are ABA accredited. That means that law schools are much more alike than they are different. It can sometimes perhaps stymie innovation, but it can also make sure that law schools are all doing things that the profession thinks need to be done. But that's a big influence on law schools and their ability to change is accreditation. Secondly, of course, the bar exam. We want our graduates to pass the bar exam. And so the bar exam is a big influence on where resources are devoted, what we talk about in law school, how we teach, and what we teach in law school. Tim mentioned US News ranking in Larry's study there of the two law schools. The US News ranking during my time as a legal educator have just really changed things a lot because legal educators pay a lot of attention to the US News ranking. We don't have time, nor do you want to be bored by hearing me talk about my opinions on the US News ranking. But let me just say this, a lot of it is based on subjective factors that are hard to control. To the extent that ranking is based on objective factors, it leaves out a lot of things that would contribute to well-being. And it may even measure some things that could undermine well-being indirectly. That's not the intent. But nonetheless, it's a real pressure on legal educators, on deans particularly. And so if you're thinking about changing, you need to know about that. And then I just want to mention the Carnegie Report on Legal Education, which came out in 2007. And at least for those of us who are trying to make changes, it's been a good roadmap because that report basically said we're trying to do three things in law school. You can think about it as head, hands, and heart. We're very good at the head. We're really good at teaching the cognitive skills you need. Historically, we've not been so good at the practical or the hands aspect of being a lawyer, but over the last 20 years or so, many more skills courses, experiential education courses have come in. We're getting a lot better at that. The third is that heart, the purpose, what we call and they call professional identity. That's really important to lead to well-being. And the Carnegie Report said, law schools, you're not doing a very good job at this third part of educating students to be a lawyer. And by the way, even on the parts you're doing a better job of, you're doing it in silos. And it's really important that these three aspects of being a lawyer become integrated. And so it's been a challenge to legal educators, and many of us are trying to live out that challenge by looking at how we can better integrate those three aspects of being a lawyer. So maybe that's a little explanation of who we are and why it can be hard to change.
That's a great explanation of how we got to be where we are. Thank you, Daisy. And I'd like to ask Plumman a quick question if I could, because my students, my sense of my students by the end of their third years, what they want to do is they want to graduate, they want to pass the bar, they want to get a job. And their view of what their life will be like is check, I graduated. Check, I passed the bar. And, I got a job. And for some of them, it's, well, I've got to get a mortgage, I got to get married, I got to have kids. But then somewhere around age 35, 38, 40, all those things are done, then I'll be happy. Right. So that's what happens in practice, right? All they have to do is get through the misery of law school and get into practice. Then they're on the road to happiness. Is that right, Plama? Is that what is happening?
That is the automatic path. Yes. And then what we discover along this automatic path is that we keep tripping along this path because these habits and these ways of thinking and relating to the practice, we just take with us into legal practice. So I just wanted to reaffirm how many of those, for example, that orientation toward thinking our way through everything, and our belief that that's the only way to resolve any situation. Well, what happens is that we cannot think our well into our well-being or into our health. And we discover that the hard way, especially when the challenge and the difficulty of legal practice forces us to confront the question of purpose. Why am I doing this? For the sake of what? And that tends to happen usually after the first 10 years of practice in my observation, which is also consistent with the fact that so many of our colleagues in the first 10 years of practice are so vulnerable to the greatest stress, substance use, depression. But once we overcome that, we begin to engage with those deeper questions. We have the connection to the relationships. We can begin to cultivate or draw on relationships. And we are in a position maybe to start having some greater autonomy, all the factors that you identified. But without encountering the difficult, like really smashing our face against the wall of these habits, we just perpetuate them without thinking, and we pay the price.
Thanks, Mom. And I'd like now to turn the panel's attention towards looking forward, kind of what are law schools? All right, so we've pretty well covered the territory of what's the problem and how did we get there. So what are law schools currently doing? Are they changing? And what are they doing to change the situation? What should they be doing to change the situation? And I'm going to offer just a couple of things. Law schools are actually doing a lot, in their individual ways. They may be having formal initiatives, curriculum changes. They may be doing informal initiatives that are extracurricular activities, but are devoted to wellness and well-being. And I just want to give two quick examples of what we've done at Georgia State that seem to have an impact on law student well-being. So the first is back about 6 years ago, I took a course on mindfulness-based stress reduction, not because I was stressed out. Actually, I was going to be taking a semester off. I was just curious. I wanted to know, maybe I've heard about this stuff. What is this stuff? You know, maybe it'll improve my teaching. And I took the course just because I took the same reason I took an improv course. Yeah, maybe it'll improve my teaching. I quickly realized, boy, the law students might really benefit from this. And I started to dig into some research about the benefits. I got the dean to give me permission to begin a program, extracurricular, non-credit, but just voluntary, for students on mindfulness, standard training. Because one of the things that I was reading on the research was really how it can benefit, mindfulness meditation can benefit your health and well-being. And here's what the ABA and this PATH report said about mindfulness. And this was kind of like the research that I'd been discovering as I approached this. It said mindfulness meditation is a practice that can enhance cognitive reframing. This is critical. That's resilience. It's, do you have a positive outlook on things, or do you have a generally negative outlook on things? You guys can guess. Which do you think lawyers tend to do? But anyway, your sense of well-being will be related to your ability to reframe your experience in a positive way. And mindfulness aids our ability to monitor our thoughts and avoid becoming emotionally overwhelmed. Research has found that mindfulness can reduce rumination, stress, depression, and anxiety. It can also, related to the well-being, it can also, says the ABA, enhance a host of competencies related to lawyer effectiveness, including, and this is critical for our students, increased focus and concentration, working memory, critical cognitive skills, we use those, reduced burnout, and ethical and rational decision-making. So the research is pretty overwhelming about what mindfulness and mindfulness meditation can do positively to affect well-being. So I decided, well, let's give it a chance. Let's see what happens at Georgia State. We inaugurated a 6 to 8 week, it depends on your year, a voluntary lunchtime program for lawyers. I've become a mindfulness-based stress instructor. So I give the classic curriculum, a little bit abbreviated for the law students. And I collaborated with a Georgia Tech professor named Paul Verhagen, who's in the psychology department, has written a compilation of all of the research done on the beneficial effects of mindfulness. And we did a study involving 3 cohorts of students who took the mindfulness training. And then we studied what effect it had, what impact. And I was happily surprised that actually our law students showed the same benefits as all the other clinical research had shown. And our empirical work has just been published, but I just wanted to tell you the study outcomes showed that the mindfulness training that we offered at law school lowered students' perceived stress and improved their management of stress, improved their ability to focus and resist distractions, so many of which are today everywhere today, actually. The training strengthened their ability to reframe their outlooks in a positive way. It enhanced their ability to not judge their inner experience or judge themselves. Lawyers have a very severe inner critic. They tend to judge everything negatively. That's part of the training. But the problem is when that negativity is turned inward, and all humans share a negativity bias, but lawyers are particularly prone to it. So that positive score on enhancing the ability not to judge yourself, not self-criticism, was a very important one. And related to that was positive scores and increasing their self-compassion, because self-compassion is itself related to emotional intelligence, ability for self-determination, which Tim talked about, and subjective well-being. Our training also increased their scores on self-acceptance and on personal growth. So what I did, those were informal, those were purely voluntary, students could take, but we had formal course that I inaugurated that I called the Reflective Lawyer, that incorporates the mindfulness training. You hear my cat in the background, I'm not going to open the door, but trust me, if I did, she'd be walking through here. Sorry about that. But the course does the same thing that the mindfulness training does, plus bring it into expressly the competencies and lawyering skills that mindfulness can help to foster. So I'd like to turn it over to Tim, if I could, and talk maybe about some of the other curricular innovations. And by the way, let me just say, I'm not the only school doing this. The mindfulness movement is really taken hold across many law schools, and formal courses on reflective practice and other things that support the kind of education of the whole lawyer are really rapidly becoming accepted and implemented at law schools.
Yeah, they are indeed. There are schools all over the country. I wanted to mention a couple of curricular innovations that I think also can have a very positive impact on well-being. One is not really a new development, although it continues to increase, and that's what we now call experiential education. Clinics, externships, courses in which students work on behalf of real clients in the real world on real cases. Experiential education is not new. I went to law school back in the 1970s, and we did have a clinic, although I couldn't get into it. It was very much a minor part of law schools 30, 40 years ago. Over the last couple of decades, the growth in clinics and externships has really been enormous. And to my mind, it's in a lot of ways the most positive thing that's happened in law schools. And it's positive for several different reasons. Let me just mention, Daisy talked about the ABA accreditation requirements and how they impact law school. ABA accreditation requirements reflect this growth in experiential education, and I think also are spurred it on to some extent. Every law school now must offer substantial opportunities for real-world clinical or externship experience. And much more recently, every student who graduates from a law school must have at least 6 credit hours in experiential courses. To my mind, that's not nearly enough. There are proposals to make it much more like 15 hours or maybe even more. But again, that's tremendous progress. Well, what does this have to do with well-being? Students are anxious for more clinical opportunities because first and foremost, they fear that they won't be competent, they won't have the skills necessary when they're licensed to practice soon. There's reason for that concern, and that's important. They want to be prepared to practice. But working on real cases for clients that they get to know can bring about real student confidence and competence. And that's very important for well-being. It also helps students remember why they went to law school for so many. Daisy talked about the loss of sense of purpose. They can recover that quite often when they get involved and they really are helping people solve problems and working on social justice issues. That might be why they came to law school. It disappeared for a while in clinics and externship can bring that back. One other thing about experiential education that's so important, that the teachers of clinical education have been real leaders and done a lot of creative work on well-being because they're working with the practice of law. They early on recognized the problems of a lack of well-being and effectiveness in serving clients. So they've done a lot of great work in bringing this. Many of the mindfulness people that are bringing this into law school, which Charity talked about, come from a clinical background. And in all clinics and externships now, reflection is a big part of the pedagogy. That is, students are required to reflect upon what they're doing, how that impacts them. And that again is, I think, crucial toward establishing well-being. So I'm obviously a big fan. I've spent much of my career doing it, but I think the more experiential education we have in law school, the better. One other development I'll mention briefly, and this is much more recent. We've used that term professional identity several times in the last hour. And I wouldn't say that it's taken over legal education by any means. It was really an innovation of that 2007 influential Carnegie study. But the American Bar Association has under consideration something that I think they were going to adopt within the next year, and that is an accreditation standard that will require all law schools to offer substantial opportunities for students to develop their professional identities. I think a lot of law schools and law professors are going to be at a bit of a loss as to about how to go about doing that, because it is a little different than what a lot of people have been doing. Let me give one quick example of how we've been doing that at Mercer now for at least 15 years. We have a required first-year course. We call it the legal profession. We used to say it was about professionalism, but in the last few years, we haven't changed the course as much, but we acknowledge that it's really about the development of professional identity. The course is focused on character, really. We tell the students that there are 6 distinctive professional virtues that you really need to internalize to be a good lawyer. You need to have a deep sense of the responsibility of serving your clients, a deep sense of responsibility to society. External rules and penalties are not going to get the job done. You have to internalize this obligation. So we focus on the professional virtues, as we call them. You know, these are just dispositions, character traits you need to have to be a good lawyer. Much of the course is focused on small section discussions of simulated problems. The problems increase in complexity over the course of the semester and require the students to deploy practical wisdom, because sometimes there might be a conflict between your loyalty to your client and your duty to the legal system, and how do you navigate that? Another crucial part of the course is something we call Inside the Legal Profession. It's based on an old show you may not remember anymore called Inside the Actors Studio, but our colleague Pat Longman interviews practicing lawyers and judges. We do this twice a week for most of the semester. We've had a remarkable array of people that are willing to be interviewed, and Pat just asked them a whole series of questions about their life and their career and what they do and why they do it and how they enjoy it. Students get an awful lot of that. Connecting them to real world exemplars is very important. We have online discussion forum in which students are able to share reflections on these difficult issues and realize that, you know, their concerns aren't only their own, they share them. It builds community among the students. Finally, I wanted to tell you, we just finished reading the reflections students give at the end of the course, and many of them said it was the most meaningful and important course they'd taken in the first year. They didn't used to say that, but I think we've learned a little bit better about how to reach them in that sense. And maybe, to my mind, one of the most significant things is many of them said they are now encouraged, reassured that they can be the person that they truly are, the person they truly want to be. They can be the family member, they can be the religious person that they learned for a while in law school. Oh, you have to put all that aside in order to be a good lawyer. And they learn, no, they really can't integrate all of that. That's just the way we have been approaching it at Mercer. I think there are many more examples that I don't have time to get into. I think Daisy has a list of resources that Plumman's going to make available afterwards of more ideas along these lines, but particular curricular innovations that make explicit for students ideas of professional identity. What kind of lawyer and person are you becoming? Can you be intentional in that process so that you can integrate your personal and professional values?
Thanks, Tim. And I think that is so important because throughout my decades of teaching law students, a theme was always students coming and saying, I got to quit law school. This just isn't me. I can't be me to do this. And in teaching my reflective lawyer class, you know, that's really an opportunity they have to discuss how they can be me, you know, as a lawyer, and me as a mother or father, and me as a community member, me as a spiritual practitioner, whichever it is, that they can align the values, you know, together. And that sort of integration is so important for overall happiness and well-being. Daisy, you've got some, I know, a wealth of information about the kinds of things that law schools are doing and the innovations that they're offering in recent years in order to support students' health and well-being.
Thank you, Charity. Yeah, a couple of things come to mind as I listen. One is, we in the law school world often divide things into curricular and extracurricular activities. And here we're really talking about changes that can kind of blend across all of the spectrum of experience that law students are having. But the main thing that I want you all to know about is that there's a lot of work that's going on to think about how we can make law school a better experience and how we can build those habits. Plowman indicated that those habits that are required in law school get carried over into practice. That's absolutely the case. And when I try to boil it down to a nutshell, I would say we want to be developing students' habits of reflection and of connection. And those can go in a variety of ways. But too often the pressures of law school and the pressures of legal practice end up eroding those capacities for reflection and connection. And those are themes we keep seeing. So one way in which we approach this is through those curricular changes, but there are other things that we can do too. And part of the reason we need to do that is law school sends powerful institutional messages about what matters and what doesn't matter. And so by doing a lot of things that don't require new course approvals or curriculum reshuffles or those kinds of things, we can still counter the dominant institutional messages. One thing that I've seen developing, and I think this is because of the ABA Law Student Division emphasis on wellness, is I know we at Mercer, and I think a lot of law schools now have a wellness week that's sponsored by the SBA. So not only are they getting practical resources there, but that's an institutional message that part of becoming a lawyer is to take care of your own wellness, well-being. So that's a really powerful message that lasts long beyond the 1 week of that program. There are programs around the country on leadership now for law schools. Well, that may not match up exactly with well-being, but it's talking about developing the side of yourself that often seems to get neglected in the law school curriculum. Georgetown has developed a really great program through their Student Services Office around resilience based on some of the recent research on grit and resilience. And they're doing really fascinating things there, not through the formal curriculum, but through a lot of other programs that are making a difference. And not only building those skills, but again, countering the dominant institutional message and giving permission for students to think that acquiring this identity of a lawyer includes these kinds of things. There's a law and the faith or religious lawyering movement that is doing interesting research, speaking, telling students, if you bring with you faith values into the practice, you don't have to put those aside. Here's some models of how you can integrate faith values into who you are as a lawyer. The Association of American Law Schools, which is the professional association for law professors, now has a balance section. Larry Krieger was there in the formative stages of that. We originally, those of us working in this, called it humanizing legal education. That wasn't seen as to be the best label. I'm not sure balance is the best label, but I have to tell you, back in my early years as a legal educator, I never would have thought that this sort of stodgy, traditional professional association for law professors would create room for a section that is focused on how do we help our students bring balance into their lives? How are we creating research around the best way to do this? There's now a leadership section as well. And that goes with some of these same themes. So I guess, mindfulness is a part of all of this. So I think just to say there have been many entry points within legal education to this discussion. I think they're all valuable and they're making a difference in how students understand what it is to be a lawyer and where wellness and well-being fit in with that.
Thanks, Daisy. And for those of you who are still hearing my cat in the background, I do not torture my cat. I think she just wants lunch.
So it's a great illustration of balance, Jerry.
Yeah.
You are taking care of your pet while you are also fulfilling professional obligations. So it's good modeling for the rest of us.
So I am eager to hear from Dawn in a moment and her reflections on, what this is sounding like from her perspective is the president of the bar, and her year of instigating these touch events. And right before we do this, though, I'd like to hear from Tim and Daisy, just very quickly. Do you have any recommendations for what the practicing bar can do to work with law schools to support law student well-being?
I think we do. We've talked about it. Tim, you were hesitating, so
Right.
I jumped down, as so often happens in our relationship. So I'll start and then he can correct me, as sometimes happens in our relationship too. So there are three things really that we've thought about. One is being good models for our law students, because as we're doing this work and trying to get better in law school about helping students see what they need to do to be flourishing or thriving lawyers. Sometimes students then go into the work world in the summer or during law school and come back and report that they're not picking up those same messages from their work environment. So modeling is really important there. Secondly, get involved with either your law school or a law school near where you live in being available to students. The role of exemplars is so important in all of this. I didn't really know lawyers before I went to law school. I didn't have an image of what lawyers' lives were like. Many of our students don't have those images. Our law school has started doing first year over the winter break, what we're calling informational interviews with alumni, asking alumni if they'll just go to coffee with a student and just talk with them. Not to lead to a job or to be a reference or anything else. Those are really powerful experiences for our law students. You may think you don't have much to offer. You have a lot to offer just by sharing your life with a law student. Those reflections Tim was talking about in the first year course that we had, one of the students this year wrote, she said the best part of this course was the oral history interview we did with a lawyer. Because he told me, I don't have to have it all figured out now. He didn't have it figured out at that point either. And he loves what he's doing and he's very successful. And she said, that was huge to me. I've had students say, you all are always telling us that lawyers care about who we are. I never felt that till I went to coffee with a lawyer. And they wanted to help me become a member of this profession. And the third thing is, which is I think we're going to talk about in a minute, is, see what you can do to be a gentle but effective voice towards law school faculty and administrators on taking this subject seriously and trying to do some things in law schools. Okay, Tim, I've invited you now to weigh in.
I have nothing to add to that. Thank you.
That's good.
I want to hear from some other folks now.
I know.
Okay, well, let's hear from Don Jones. How can lawyers work with law schools to support law students?
So I have taken copious notes that I'm going to use in ongoing support of law students in local bar associations, and even as I roll off as president of the bar within the next month and a half. Let me start with, I so easily and readily identify with most of, if not all of the comments you guys have shared about from official studies and report findings as it relates to law student experiences, to the last couple of comments about how I, growing up, did not, in fact, know any lawyers at all. So I will say I had more than one solid idea about what I thought lawyers were like, and it all came from TV, and it was all wrong. And it wasn't necessarily positive. I'm sure that doesn't surprise anybody, but so to have this conversation and to hear it today is quite inspiring. I often reflect out loud this year in particular about when I believe Bob Kaufman, then president of the bar, 7 years ago, created this movement that I now call a movement, attorney wellness. that has now brought into lawyer assistance program to the subcommittees that are doing this monthly work, and Plumman's going to clean it up after I forget everything else, lawyer assistance to even Solace. We have other committees of the State Bar of Georgia that support attorneys and their families, whether they're victims of tornadoes to floods to just giving them the support they need to continue in their practice and as well as to support them in their personal lives. But I distinctly remember the discussion that we initially had when the wellness events came up, and they were by and large related to physical activity and being thoughtful about eating and diet and that kind of thing. And even then, it made so much sense to me. I have never been confused about how everything you do, no matter what your profession, that it's obviously and directly connected to who you are as a person, physically, mentally, spiritually. And I'm sure I benefited from the 14 years of nursing, leading me into the practice of law as much as anything else. But it was surprising to me, the pushback that we got from a significant number of our bar members, from the highest reaches of our bench in this state, who were like, we're not going to agree to CLEs where people get, CLE credit for yoga. And we're like, that's not what we're talking about, right? To, I know this being recorded, but I'm just being honest, to conversations where people were really struggling as members of the bar as to why we cared about wellness and well-being. And I think about that all the time because one of the few, and I cringe at even saying benefit, but one of the few benefits I think that has come out of this collective experience that we've all gone through as individuals, as a community, as humans, and certainly as a bar, is that we better understand and appreciate the fact that who we are in the practice of law and how successful we are in the practice of law is directly related to how healthy we are, to how physically, spiritually, mentally healthy and well we are. And I think from this point on, very few people will be questioning why wellness is a part of our regular state bar discussions and activities. So having given that as a background, I'd like to say there's some takeaways, again, that I took from this discussion today as state bar president. I also, as someone who works with minority bar associations, and I see some fellow local bar leaders and minority bar leaders from throughout the state who I hope will speak up. But I know that we carry on law student related activities. And I think that's something that the state bar can continue to motivate local bars. We have regular conversations. As president, as a member of the board of governors, as an officer, we have numerous opportunities to talk to local bars and engage them in the work that we think is important in the work we do. We also have the opportunity to lead. So to the extent that you guys are telling us modeling, involvement, and supporting faculty and the work that you all do in this regard, that we certainly, as a state bar of Georgia, can continue to make it a priority. And I think folks looking at our state bar, and there are other bars in the country. We're one of the largest. We're not the largest. A year or two ago, we're the 6th largest. I don't know where we are today. But we're one of the biggest, and every state does not have, as you all likely know, some of the law students may not know, every state does not have a mandatory bar that requires you to be a member in order to practice law in a state. But it gives us a level of authority and gravitas that I think other bars, I really didn't appreciate until this year how many other bar associations look to us. They pay attention to what we say. They pay attention to the priorities that we've set. And frankly, I was blown away as early as last August, September at National Council of Bar Presidents meetings related to ABA events, where people were asking us to share the wellness stuff that we were doing. They were asking us, and then as late as January, February, in another National Conference of Bar Presidents meeting, one of the first sessions shouted out State Bar of Georgia for its wellness activities and for its Use Your Six, which unfortunately we don't, there's some states that offer counseling to law students for free. We're not there yet, but we do have 6 counseling sessions, 6 hourly counseling sessions offered to every State Bar member per year for free. So it's a movement as far as I'm concerned, and it's a movement that is only going to improve the success of law students, as we've discussed today, and certainly bleed into, in a good way, the practice of law in the profession, whether you're in Georgia or elsewhere. So the 2 things I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, so I do have some written notes, and the 2 things that were my takeaways from thinking about and prepping for this discussion, and I'm going to quote Plowman in one of the in my third point, but promoting and encouraging conversations, because what I didn't see at all, I was in big law for 10 years. I started off doing insurance defense. I was in-house lawyer at Grady, and it's the last 7 years I've hung my own shingle, but I never participated in a conversation where I took away something of value related to my professional brand. And you guys are using the term professional ID, my notes, professional identity, which I love, but I never got that in the setting. And in fact, it wasn't necessarily helpful if you suggested that you had anything going on, any interest outside of your work-related activities. It certainly wasn't supported. And so I think we can do a lot as a bar and as members of the bar to promote and encourage conversations, informal conversations and formal conversations. I think there are opportunities for summer associates, and I don't even know if they still have law clerks, but when I had a job in law school for a smaller insurance defense firm, I was a law clerk, about well-being, about all of the things we talked about today, and about how important your health and well-being plays a part in your success as a lawyer. Again, these were not conversations that I ever enjoyed having to date as a practicing lawyer. I'm getting involved as a member of the bar at this level, but it really hasn't permeated into the office space that I've seen, not having been in the office space in the last year. And the other thing is, so I think we can do that. We often as lawyers talk about best practices. That's our, we love to push out there, what's best practices? We have what I call in-services. We have these programs in-house, for lawyers you work with to talk about best practices and to share new ideas and new thoughts and new ways to succeed and to serve your clients. And I think this needs to be included in those conversations. So I think that's one way we can do it. 2 is showing how, and we used this term earlier, balanced, healthy, summer associates, law clerks, law students, how making sure that that it makes a better, well-rounded, more competent attorney. Things that we've talked about today. And not only does that, but retention is still a problem. As far as I know, it's still a problem in many law firm settings. Retention's a problem. Client satisfaction's a problem. Nobody really teaches you how to connect with clients. And it can be very intimidating and frankly, quite anxiety provoking to have face time with clients and to understand the hierarchy and levels of the partners in the room and the associates in the room and even the counsel in the room, and understanding your role in that. And I think, again, when you're talking about serving clients, meeting the needs of who the clients that you serve, the public trust that we all enjoy as practicing members of the bar, and retaining happy, productive lawyers for the future. I mean, all of these things I think are important, and something that the bar can highlight and continue to have discussions on. The last thing I'll say is at the suggestion of, I believe, Professor Scott, who will always be Professor Scott to me, and Plowman, we have a letter that the State Bar of Georgia will be sending out hopefully this week. Everybody's kind of busy with our annual meeting, but hopefully by Friday, this letter is going to go out under my signature and likely a staff member of the bar this week, that highlights, and I'm going to use a quote from Plowman. He described it as an open gesture of collaboration This letter is a way for us to communicate to all of the law school deans our interest and our priority, and continuing to support, as we have this year, the well-being and wellness of our members of the bar and our law students. So with that, I think I've taken way too much time and appreciate it, but hopefully that I've been listening. I know this is important to our bar. I know this is important to our executive committee and our board of governors, and you will likely see something written about this in the upcoming bar journal. Thanks.
Thank you, Dawn. That was terrific. I really appreciate it. We all appreciate how much you've done as president of the bar to further the well-being of the profession, as well as of law schools, and picking up on your theme of the importance of conversations, both conversations within the profession and between the bar and legal education. I just want to encourage any practicing lawyers on this to go ahead and collaborate. We've given wellness presentations to our student body, and of course we talk about it, some of us in our classes. But you know what the students really want to hear from? They want to hear from the lawyers. You know, you're fine, Professor Scott. We like you and all, blah blah blah. But whenever we have had lawyers come in and talk about why it's important, and particularly when they're willing to share their own personal stories about their own personal challenges and struggles and how they've overcome them and how they've struggled with them, that I can't tell you is hands down the most impactful experience that our law students can have in terms of being supported, you know, and feeling that they're supported in a collaboration between the practicing bar and legal education. So Plumman, I would like to turn it over to you to close us out.
And I cannot express my gratitude for the richness of perspective that you have brought. Really, this was deeply educational, informing us about everything that's going on in law school, understanding why law school is the way it is, but also very inspiring in highlighting the possibilities that exist and also pointing out what is already happening. So things are happening. We just need to continue to build on that. And I love how frequently the idea of integration came up in this conversation, because I have noticed what an important principle this is for us. On the individual level, as we're integrating all of these different parts of ourselves, bringing them together to create a cohesive professional identity that can truly serve us, our clients, and society at large, but also professionally, bringing together all the different parts of our profession and giving space to all the different voices and experiences, so we expand our idea of what it is like to be a lawyer, which ultimately benefits society at large. So with that, my deep thanks to all, Professor Scott, Professor Floyd, President Jones, what a delight. Thank you and take care, be well.
Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
And all participants, thank you so much for joining us in this important conversation.
And I think I speak for all of us. We're more than happy to answer any individual questions.
Absolutely.
If anybody wants to be in touch with us by email or otherwise.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Indeed. Resources
Happy to
will
continue
follow.
the conversation.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you very, very much.
Candace, you and I are
everybody.
going to be talking soon.
Take care.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.